is this work? Can you hear me with this microphone? Okay, so I don't like to have these things in my hand. Yeah. So I'm not going to be able to talk tonight because I have to hire a lawyer to sue Fred for copyright infringement. Now, I find out he was stealing all my legal briefs without telling me. So, and the other thing, I was going to talk about writing, but through my Hollywood connections, I got a hold of the script for Game of Thrones tomorrow, and I thought I would. All right, I won't give any spoilers. So I just finished my book tour for Perfect Alibi, which is my 22nd book, and when I do talks, usually it's at a bookstore. It could be sometimes a library, sometimes it's a university. I always have a Q&A after, and I've done 6 book tours in Europe. I've done them in Canada, and I always get the same 3 questions, no matter whether I'm in Ottawa or Oslo or Oklahoma City. And that's, since you were a lawyer for so many years, how did you become a writer? How do you physically write a book? Do you use a computer or an outline? And then where do your ideas come from? So I got sick and tired of this, and I'm going to just cut to the chase and talk about all that stuff. Also, it was interesting to me because I have 22 books, and I was looking. They list them. They always list your books at the front, and I realized that 11 of them are standalone. A standalone is a book that's not part of a series. You can just read them in any order. They don't have continuing character, and they have 11 in series. I have 3 different series, and for years I stayed away from writing a series like The Plague for reasons. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about that. And then afterwards, I love the question sessions because I am the first published author I ever met. And I didn't meet me as a published author until I was in my 30s. I only had 1 writing class my whole life. I got a C+ in college in creative writing. So I would have loved to have the chance to ask somebody, how do you do this stuff? So any questions you have, I love the questions, and I'd really be excited about answering. Just hold them till the end. So when I was in the 7th grade as a result of an overdose of Perry Mason novels, I decided that when I grew up, I was going to be a criminal defense lawyer and try murder cases. And as you heard, that's what I did for 25 years. Everything that Perry did in the books I did in real life, and just not to brag, but really the only difference between me and Perry Mason is that all of his clients were innocent and mine. But as far as the writing stuff goes, and this is the truth, I never ever entered my head to be a writer. The reason for that is I'm a voracious reader. I still read 2 to 3 books a week, and I started that in elementary school. And I was in awe of writers, so it just never occurred to me that I could be a writer, so I never even thought about it. And I didn't even take a shot at writing till my last semester in law school. As you heard, I worked my way through NYU teaching during the day, and between a full teaching load and then full course load at night, I had enough time to eat and breathe, and that was it. But then a really wonderful thing happened my last semester. Was I got through in 3 years like the day students by going summers, and my last summer semester my wife graduated from college, and so she had a job and could pay the rent those 2 months, so I didn't have to teach. And since I had a job in Oregon clerking for Judge Schwab, I just had to get D's in my classes to get out, so I was never that interested in grades, and so I just I had this free summer, and I'd always worked. I'd never had a free summer before, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with myself? And I decided I was going to try to solve what was for me one of life's great mysteries, which is how do those guys fill up 400 pages with words? I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but I'd be reading these big books and say, where did this guy think up all this stuff? So I decided to write a novel based on my experiences in West Africa, not to get published, because I didn't even know how you would do that, but just to see could I write more than 25 pages about something. And so it took 2 years. The book was 186 pages. I was very proud of myself that I actually got more than 25. But when you're an attorney, trained to be very unemotional and objective about your work. And reading the book objectively and unemotionally, I realized it wasn't very good, so I never tried to get it published, but I did find out that I really love writing. It was great to be able to create a three-dimensional world where everything worked out exactly the way you wanted it, unlike real life. So in real life, I would be in court and the judge would say, well, Mr. Margolin, I read your memo and your motion, and I'm going to deny it and sentence your client to die. And you have to say, oh, thank you, Your Honor, thank you, Your Honor. But then I could go home and I could write a chapter, and just as the judge turns down my motion, a samurai comes out and cuts his head off. Blood comes out and dies screaming in horror. So if you're a writer, you don't have to take Xanax or go for therapy. You know, it's very good. If someone pisses you off, you just kill them the most hideous way. So it makes you really feel good. So over the years, I dabbled with writing. Didn't get anything published. I got rejected mostly. But then in my 30s, I sent a short story into, and it was my first crime short story, into Mike Shane Mystery Magazine, and I forgot about it because months went by and I didn't hear from him. And then one day I walked into my law office and there was a pile of mail, and in the middle I could still see it was a gray envelope with raised black lettering from Mike Shea Mystery Magazine, and I just assumed it was a rejection because that's the only interaction I'd ever had with a publisher. But when I opened up the letter, it said, "Dear Mr. Margolin, we were wondering if you would be willing to accept $65 from us to give us the honor of publishing your story." And my immediate thought was that these guys were really stupid, because if they negotiated with me, I would have paid them twice that to get into proof. This was like the most amazing thing that had ever happened to me. So what I got out of this was self-confidence, because quite frankly, I had no self-confidence that anyone would ever actually publish something I'd written. But here was a national magazine. They were paying me for a short story. So I thought, maybe I'll take a shot at writing a serious novel. And I have to tell you, my entire writing career has been beyond bizarre. I mean, it's really been freaky. And so what happened was, when I was clerking the Court of Appeals, I ran across the Peyton Allen murders, which, does anyone remember them? You have to be really old. So, now I've done 30 homicide cases. I've read Helter Skelter, some of the really famous true crime. I don't think in the history of the United States there's ever been a more bizarre, complex, and interesting murder case than Peyton Allen. And since it was an Oregon case, and at that time in the 70s, we really didn't have a lot of writers. You heard been on the board of Portland Arts and Lectures. We have so many great writers now. We actually have an Oregon Book Awards, but back in the 70s, there were very few Oregon writers, and none of them were writing legal thrillers, so I had this little gem all to myself. But at that point, I had only had that one writing class. I'd never met anyone who wrote a book or was in publishing, and I was just sort of forging ahead, writing this thing without any idea what I'd even do when I finished. I didn't know what you did with a manuscript. And out of the blue, I get a call from Marty Bauer. And Marty and I had roomed next to each other our first year at NYU Law School, and then we had a couple of classes together the second year, and then we both disappeared from each other's lives. I got married, moved to Oregon, he stayed in New York, and Marty wanted to know, he said he and his wife wanted to visit Oregon, and on vacation, could we get together? And I said, yeah. I said, stay at the house, because I was really happy to hear from him. He's a really nice guy. And I said, stay at the house and I'll take time off from work and I'll show you the gorge and Mount Hood and stuff. So he lands, and I asked him the question any of you guys would ask someone who you hadn't seen in 4 or 5 years. We were driving in the car and I said, so Marty, what have you been doing? And it turns out that Marty was one of 3 lawyers for the largest literary agency in the world. And I said, Marty, I'm writing a book. And Marty said, oh shit. He started screaming, tried to get out of the car on the freeway. No, actually, He was really very nice. I explained that I had no writing experience. I didn't really know what I was doing was any good. And I said, could you take my 5 chapters back to New York and just have someone from the agency call or write and say, you know, this is really fabulous, keep doing it, or it's, you know, really awful, stop. And so Marty took the 5 chapters back. I went back to my law practice, and about 6 weeks later, I'm in trial, and I come back around 5:30, assuming that everyone would be gone, but everyone's sitting around with champagne. So I said, you know, I thought someone had won a case or something. I said, what happened? I said, well, your agent called, which I didn't know I had one. What Marty had done was he liked the 5 chapters. So there was a guy at the agency who had never sold a book. He was an apprentice agent. He had been a secretary for an editor at Pocketbooks. And Marty said, you know, my friend in Oregon wrote this, see what you could do with it, because he liked the chapters. So Jed got the bright idea of calling up his old boss at Pocketbooks and showing him the chapters. And he liked the chapters, and I got a book contract. So my advice, I'm always asked, how do you get an agent? How do you get published? And I always tell people, go to law school, get very friendly. So all of a sudden I'm a published writer, which was really weird because it sort of like just dropped on me. That book, Heartstone, came out in '78. Then in '81 I published a second book, The Last Innocent Man, and that I didn't write for 12 years. And the reason I didn't write for 12 years is, if you remember, my real passion was criminal defense. That was the thing I've always wanted to do. And the same year my first book came out, I argued at the US Supreme Court, and my daughter was born, so it was a pretty good year. And then in between the 2 books, I started getting hired to do big murder cases and major appeals, and all the stuff I wanted to do since I was a kid started happening. So I put the writing on the back burner and didn't do anything until 1992, when my wife and I had a dinner party at our house. And after dinner, I got in a conversation with one of the guests and got an idea for a 3rd book. So I thought, oh, you know, I hadn't had a book published in a long time, so I thought that would be pretty cool to get a 3rd book published. So I knocked the book off in about, 6 months, 500-page manuscript, didn't take it that seriously. Just was hoping that, you know, maybe I could get a 3rd book. And I called up my agent, who I hadn't spoken to a lot in the intervening 12 years. And I said, Gene, you know, I just finished the 3rd book. Would you be willing to look at it? And she said, sure, but my son is getting married in Paris. So I'm going to be in Europe for 6 weeks. But she said, you can send it in, and then, you know, when I get back, I'll look at it. I said, great. I said, you know, you waited 12 years for me. I can wait a couple of weeks for you. So I just sent it in with and as honest to God, no expectations whatsoever about this thing. I just thought it'd be sort of neat to have a 3rd book. Well, again, my whole writing career has been very bizarre. The week before Gene comes back from Europe, I start getting letters from all over the country from people that I have not spoken to in years. And each one of these letters contains a copy of an article from the New York Times business section. Now, to put this thing in perspective, remember we're talking 1992, 93. Now, I'm known for writing legal thrillers, but there was no such thing as a legal thriller before 1987. Before 1987, a book with a lawyer and a murder was a murder mystery. Nobody took them seriously. They did not get reviewed on the front pages of the New York Times Book Review or anywhere in the New York Times Book Review. They didn't make the bestseller list. Perry Mason, Earl Stanley Garden, never wrote a legal thriller. He wrote murder mysteries. So in 1987, Scott Turow wrote a book called Presumed Innocent. And it's an excellent, excellent novel, but unfortunately it was about a lawyer and a murder. And that presented for our Strauss Giroux, the publisher, with a problem. They had to figure out how to get this thing recognized as something unusual. And somebody came up with the brilliant idea saying, hey, this isn't a murder mystery, it's a legal thriller. It's a book written by a lawyer, that gives the reader an inside look at the law. And the strategy worked. The book was on the New York Times list for 2 years. Then in 1989, John Grisham published The Firm. And the legal thriller genre was in full blast. Okay, so what was this article about? Well, the article was about the fact that the public was frothing at the mouth to get their hands on legal thrillers, but publishers didn't have any books. Now, there were lawyers that were sending novels in to try to capitalize on Thoreau and Grisham's success, but either the books were really badly written or the guy had his practice was probate. And there's not a lot of edge-of-your-seat thrills in probate. I don't want to insult anyone who's a probate lawyer, but really. So this is the honest-to-God truth. In this article is a little sentence, and the sentence basically was that every publisher in America would kill their mother to get a hold of a criminal defense lawyer who had written a novel. And I'm thinking that God had created a genre that only I in the universe fit into. So when Gene came back, I'm not my maturity level's probably about 15 now, but fortunately, Gene's very mature. And I said, do you see the article? See the article? She said, yes. I said, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to say? I'm going to think. And she hung up on me. So I'm out at Black Butte with the kids and the family right before school. And I decided to call in to see if there's any emergencies in my law practice. And there's a little note, call your agent. So I called Jean up. I said, what's up? She said, where are you going to be August 4th? I said, I don't know, working on a brief in my office. Why? She says, oh, we're going to auction your book. And my eyes rolled back and boom, I was out like a light. To explain that, the way a book is normally sold by an agent, if they will take the manuscript and send it to one editor at one publishing house at a time. Now these guys are very busy, so it could take 2 to 6 months before they actually read your manuscript. If they like it, they'll make an offer. If they don't, they'll pass, and you've got to go through this all over again. But if your agent thinks that she has a bestseller on her hands, she will send the book out to everybody in publishing she thinks might be interested and set a date for an auction for the rights. And that was the first time when I heard the word auction that I thought that something unusual might happen. And it did. Everything you dream of, your bucket list if you're a writer, happened with Gone But Not Forgotten, my third book. Except they didn't win the Pulitzer Prize. But other than that, it was made into a movie. It sold well over 1 million copies. It was on the New York Times list for 10 weeks and got up to number 3, sold in 27 foreign countries. Book of the Month Club, Main Selection Literary Guild, and on and on and on and on. And I was just sort of like shell-shocked because I wish I could say, oh, I knew it was going to be a bestseller, but I honestly did not. So I go out on book tour. The book does incredibly well. The smoke clears. And now I've got to figure out what am I going to do next. And my gut reaction was, now just Gone But Not Forgotten, the main character is Betsy Tannenbaum. She's a lovely 35-year-old single mother who also is a brilliant attorney who's made a national reputation as a woman attorney who represents women in cases involving women's issues. And she gets involved with Martin Darius, a very mysterious multimillionaire who may or may not be the Rose Killer, a horrifying serial killer who dehumanizes women before he kills them. So the book puts Betsy's values as a woman and person at odds with her duty as a defense attorney to represent every client to the maximum of your ability. So the book was incredibly successful, and my gut reaction is, write a second Betsy Tannenbaum book. But then I remembered Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle hated Sherlock Holmes. He wanted to write historical novels, and the public wouldn't read them. Anytime he'd write something that didn't have Sherlock in it, they would not buy the books, and then they'd say, when are you going to do another Sherlock? He even tried to murder Sherlock Holmes by throwing him off Reichenbach Falls. But the public clamored for more homes, so he had to bring them back from the dead. So I was thinking, what if I write a second Betsy Tannenbaum and it's twice as successful as Gone but Not Forgotten? Then I would have to write Betsy Tannenbaum serial killer books for the rest of my life, and you'll go insane. So I decided to take a chance and write a book that had the same. Now, Gone, for those of you who haven't read it, it's really freaky. It scares the hell out of people. Even to this date, I have people come up and tell me that they had nightmares when they read it, and they tried reading it by themselves at home and couldn't do it. So I mean, this has happened a lot. So I thought, well, it's a freaky, scary book. Let me try to do something different. So I wrote a book called After Dark. After Dark has even more dead bodies than Gone but Not Forgotten. It's got, all my books have tons of twists, turns, and surprise endings, but it's a love story. It's Beauty and the Beast with lawyers. And so I called up my editor at Doubleday and I said, David, I've got an idea for a new book, but it's not a Betsy Tannenbaum. He said, great. We wanted Gone to be an event. We don't want it to be a series. And I said, oh, wow. So that took all the pressure off. The third book I wrote, Burning Man, is a coming-of-age book with lawyers. So what I was doing is just using the general framework of a legal thriller, lawyer and a murder, but to do different things. And I've tried to do that with every one of my books. I try not to repeat myself, to do something different each time. The seventh book I wrote was called Wild Justice, and it introduced Amanda and Frank Jaffe, a father-daughter criminal defense team in Portland. And that was supposed to be a standalone. It wasn't supposed to be the start of a series. Then I wrote The Associate, where there's a young lawyer in a big law firm who gets framed for murder and he needs a defense attorney. So I thought, well, I'll just invent one. But then I thought, why reinvent the wheel? I really like Amanda Jaffe. Why don't I give her like a little cameo role? So Amanda's his lawyer. She's in for about 75 pages scattered through the book. Then the next book I wrote was called Ties That Bind. Now, the way I work, my writing process, I get an idea, and that's the hardest thing for me. Writing is very easy for me. I have no problem writing. Getting an idea that is complicated enough to fill up a 400-page book is very difficult. And so I will not write a single word until I've got the ending of the book. The ending for me is the single most important part of any book. How many of you have read a book or seen a movie that's fabulous and has a stupid ending? Okay, so what do you tell your friends? I just finished this book. It was okay, but the ending was so you forget you loved that book, or you loved that movie until the end left a horrible taste in your mouth. Flip it over. How many of you have seen a movie or read a book that was okay and had a fabulous ending? What do you tell? Oh my God, when I found out the butler did it, I couldn't believe. You forget the book was really mediocre. So for me, I will not write a single word until I've got the ending. I can change it, and I've done that, but I have to have something that I'm shooting for. And my thing is, if you have a brilliant idea, you have to have a brilliant ending. So to prove that I'm not lying, I got the idea for executive privilege in 1995. Could the President of the United States be a serial killer? And I thought it was a great idea. I had a lot of really... Life imitates art, huh? So, but I just could never figure out, if the president's surrounded by Secret Service and they have the press all over, how would he do it? So I didn't write that book till 2005. And I was coming back from Black Beauty after having finished the book. I was on vacation again and trying to think what to do next. And like lightning struck my brain. I said, oh my God, that's how to end that. So it took me 10 years, but I just wouldn't even start until I had the ending. So once I've got the ending and I've been thinking about the book, I do a very extensive outline. My outlines usually take 1 to 3 months. And I'm talking about, I kept my law office to write in, so I'm in there 7:30 every day, usually leave 3:30 or 4. So I'm not writing, I'm thinking about the plot 6-7 hours a day. And I do this for maybe 3 months, and I literally talk my way through the book. Then once I get the outline done, The rest is pretty easy because I actually have the book written in shorthand. It's a Reader's Digest condensed book, really. So I take each paragraph and turn it into a chapter, and the first draft is never publishable. It's not publishable quality. Then I spend months and months editing for quality. So now you know everything I know about writing. That's about it. So when I wrote the outline for Ties That Bind, the Jaffes were not in it. But after I finished it, I said, you know, Frank and Amanda Jaffe would fit into this book really well. And I never faced the challenge of taking a character from a previous book and moving their life forward. So I thought, let me try that. That'll be a cool thing to do. So there are 5 Frank and Amanda Jaffes. There are 4 Dana Cutlers, scattered, but they're scattered. Like, so I did a Frank and Amanda, and then I did a couple of standalones, so I didn't have to write series. Now the latest book, this is a big print edition. I have lousy eyesight, so I brought this one to read. So I started a brand new series with The Third Victim with Robin Lockwood. And I've never read before, but I started my book tour for this at the Tucson Festival of Books. And they put me on a panel with literary writers, Elizabeth Berg and Andre Dubus III. I've never had the word Phil Margolin and literary in the same sentence before, so I was sort of shocked that they wanted me, but I loved it. But they wanted me to read a portion of the book, and I never read because I figure if I do read it, once you get to that part in the book, it's boring because you get pulled out. And if you read the book, it's boring because you've read it already. But I had to do it. So what I did was I found that the first 4 pages are really a great introduction to Robin. And so I'm going to read them to you because she's a really unusual character. And then I'm going to take questions. So at 5:30 on a rainy Monday morning in October, Robin Lockwood ran the 5 miles from her apartment to McGill's Gym in Portland's Pearl District. For decades, the Pearl had been home to dusty, decaying warehouses, and then the developers moved in. Overnight, most of the grimy, rundown buildings were replaced by gleaming high-end condos, trendy restaurants, and chic boutiques. McGill's was on the ground floor of one of the few old brick buildings that had escaped gentrification. It was dimly lit and filled with the rank odor you never found in modern air-conditioned workout emporiums. Barry McGill, the gym's owner, was taciturn, monosyllabic, and profane. Rumor had it that he had mob connections, but people with any amount of common sense were wise enough to not ask him about it. Salt and pepper stubble sprouted on McGill's fleshy jowls and whiskey-reddened cheeks. He'd fought as a middleweight in the 1980s and had the broken nose and scar tissue to prove it, but his days as a 165-pounder were long past, and the weight he carried in his gut, butt, and thighs had elevated him to the heavyweight division. Lockwood, McGill called out when Robin walked in. Yeah? See the kid slacking off at the heavy bag? A young man in his early 20s was hitting the bag with lackadaisical punches that barely made it move. Robin judged his weight at welter around 147 pounds, slightly more than her 140, and she couldn't see an ounce of fat on him. That's Mitch Healy, McGill said. He just won his first 2 MMA fights and his head's swollen. Want to take him down a peg? Robin was 5 foot 8 inches with a wiry build, blue eyes, high cheekbones, and short blonde hair. She'd earned some of her Yale Law School tuition fighting in mixed martial arts matches and had ranked as high as 9th nationally. Her straight nose was a testament to her defensive skills as a cage fighter. In case you haven't noticed, Robin said, that kid is a man and you just told me he's in training? Hey, I never took Rockin' Robin for a pussy, McGill said, referring to Robin's ring nickname and the old rock and roll song Robin's fans would sing when she walked into the octagon. Screw you, Barry, Robin snapped back. Hey, I wouldn't ask you if I didn't think you could give him a hard time. Robin gave McGill a hard stare. He raised an eyebrow and Robin sighed. You gonna cover my dental work? Fuck no, McGill answered. You always were a cheap bastard. McGill grinned. Robin went to the locker room to change. "Hey, Mitch," McGill shouted when Robin returned. "Yeah? Come on over here. I got someone for you to spar with." Healy looked around as he walked over. "Are they in the locker room?" "Nah, she's right in front of you." Healy looked at Robin and then he laughed. "She's a girl, Barry." "That's one brilliant deduction. You're a regular Sherlock Holmes." "I'm not sparring with a girl. You see anyone else around? You've been dancing with that bag for the past 20 minutes. Might as well dance with a flesh and blood female. Hell, maybe you can even give her a few pointers." Healy hesitated, then he gave Robin the once-over and shrugged. "All right, let's go." Now, Robin had stopped fighting professionally after suffering a brutal knockout on a pay-per-view card in Las Vegas in her first year in law school, but she was still in great shape. Robin could see that Healy had no respect for her, which meant that he would underestimate her. When they got on the mat, Robin started moving like a beginner, flicking out slow, sloppy jabs. Healy looked bored and he pawed at her unenthusiastically. Robin moved a little closer. Healy threw another lazy jab. Robin slid behind it, spun behind him, picked him up in the air, and while Healy thrashed around, aimed his head at the mat and drove him straight down. When he hit the mat, Robin wrapped her legs around in a figure-4 scissors and slapped on a chokehold. Healy struggled for a while, then tapped out. Robin rolled off Healy and jumped to her feet. Healy sprang up. He looked furious. Robin circled and Healy charged. Robin counted on his anger, clouding his judgment. She sidestepped the charge and landed a shot to Healy's jaw that would have unhinged it if she hadn't pulled the punch. Healy stumbled and Robin snapped a kick that landed on the side of Healy's head. She pulled the kick too, but it still sent Healy sideways. "All right, that's enough," McGill shouted. Robin bounced out of range and Healy glared at her. "I said that's enough. Now why don't you start your workout again and let's put some effort into it this time." McGill rarely complimented anyone, but he nodded at Robin. "Next month's a freebie," he said, as she took off her headgear and walked to the weights. "Who the fuck was that?" Healy asked. "That's a girly girl who just kicked your ass," McGill answered. Healy watched Robin for a second before turning back to McGill. "Is she single?" So that is my spiel. Before I take the questions, I want to tell you, I love being a celebrity because it helps me raise money for very good causes, and this is a very good cause, so put a lot of money into those envelopes. Anyway, any questions you want to ask, I'd love to answer them, and I'm really tough to embarrass, so. Anyone? Yes?
Did you ever have any cases as a criminal defense lawyer, like, inspired any of your stories as a writer?
Yeah, it's really funny because I had 30 homicides, so people think, oh, you must have 30 novels, but really, most murder cases are not, they're interesting for the lawyer because there are emotions and evidence issues. They're usually pretty boring. But 2 of my 30 homicide cases involved people who had been sentenced to prison for life for murder, and I was hired after the conviction. And when I did the appeals, I realized that they were factually completely innocent. And so it took me 4 years in each case, but I got them both out of prison. And one of them was the inspiration for The Burning Man. It's very heavily fictionalized, but a lot of the stuff in there is what actually happened in the case. And there are a couple other bits from cases that I've used, but the only ones that are actually heavily fictionalized versions of real cases are Heartstone, which was my first novel, and I wasn't involved in that case, but I heavily fictionalized Burning Man, and then the book I'm most proud of is the only one that's an outlier. It's a historical novel, Worthy Brown's Daughter, that was inspired by the 1853 Oregon Territorial Supreme Court case that held that you couldn't have slaves in the Oregon Territory. And we had about 70 slaves in Oregon in the 1840s and 50s. People don't know that. And the real case was really a heartbreaking case, and I used that for Worthy Brown. Any other? Yeah.
When your book, for example, The Last Innocent Man, is going to be made into a movie, what's your role? What was your role? Okay,
well, there's a clause in your contract that says once you sell your book to the movies, you lose all artistic control because they don't want the writer. But I actually had a part in that movie. I got very friendly with the producer, and we were riding around doing location scouting, and I told him I don't know anything about movies. I really like to learn about them. Could I hang around? And he had had very bad experience with writers, and he was reluctant. I said, well, listen, once you give me my check, you could put mutants and spaceships in. I don't give a shit. So I like you. So I had a part. I had two lines. I was a jury foreman. I was amazing. I should have gotten an Oscar nomination, but they stabbed me in the back. There was politics involved. But I did get to be on the set for about 8 days. They actually asked me, called me up. I was a competitive chess player. They called me up Sunday morning. First scene, Ed Harris and David Suchet are playing chess, and nobody knew how to set the board up. So I came up and I set up the final moves in a very famous chess game and showed them what to do. And they let me listen to the sound equipment and go to daily. So it was really fun. The other one, Gone But Not Forgotten with Brooke Shields, I had no connection at all. They just bought the thing outright. We never heard from them again. It was just sort of weird, but.
Let your baby go.
Huh?
I mean, you just have to let it go.
Oh, I don't care. I got paid. I'm a puzzle person, and the books are really sort of puzzles for me. Once they're done, I've had about half of them optioned for film, and it's interesting to see the screenplays, what people do with your work. So it doesn't bother me. And obviously, I was lucky because both movies were really good, and you'd rather have a good movie based on your book than a bad one. But really, I just don't care. So. Yeah.
So I am not an avid reader, but I am an avid supporter of the library and the Library Foundation and all that. So I get that. So if I were to say to you, I'm willing to take a risk and read your most favorite book.
Well, it wouldn't be a risk. It would change your entire life.
I got to stay with this. I got to stay awake at night.
Most people read my books. They're in an ashram.
I know
within
that.
months.
We're starting at an elementary level here.
Okay. So the three books that I just mentioned, the one that I really love the most is Worthy Brown's Daughter. It's not typical of what I've done, but it does have a murder trial at the end with a surprise ending and stuff, but it's pretty serious literature. The two thrillers are Executive Privilege and Gone But Not Forgotten. I think those two are my really best books. And if you don't like them, yeah. If you don't like them, means you have really bad taste in literature. Anyone else? Yes.
Why did you make the decision to put Robin in the second book in such a limited way? It seemed like she wasn't in there much.
You mean in Perfect Alibi? Well, she's in there a lot. It's just the structure of the book. I mean, it's trying to figure out how to present this plot, and it's pretty complicated, and it has a lot of different. I like to read books where you have a whole bunch of stories that seem to have no connection, and then they come together at the end. So Perfect Alibi is sort of like that. Third Victim, where she gets introduced, is more traditional. There's one case with a serial killer, and you go A, B, C, D. This one, it's got a really weird ending, which is actually based on real cases. I'm not going to tell anyone what it is because it's a real sort of a shocker. But in order to make the book, I thought, more interesting, I would do what I like to do and have all these stories going on that seem to have nothing to do with each other, and then bring them in. So that was why. So yeah.
Do you have favorite thriller authors?
Well, I get asked this a lot, and I read about 2 to 3 books a week. So what I do have is favorite books. My favorite thrillers are A Time to Hunt and Point of Impact by Stephen Hunter. Red Dragon, which is the first Thomas Harris Hannibal Lecter book, which is a brilliant, perfectly written novel. Relic by Douglas Preston and Lincoln Childs, which scared the shit out of me. It's about a monster in the Museum of Natural History, and it's really tough to scare people, with a book. And I was reading it like this. And then my all-time favorite thriller is a book no one has ever heard of. It's called Stone City by Mitchell Smith. I think it's a masterpiece. It's over 600 pages. If you've ever wondered what it'd be like if you went to prison, it's about a college professor who is convicted of vehicular homicide and is sent to the worst prison in the state. And there's a serial killer in the prison killing the horrible prisoners. And for some weird reason, not weird, but some very interesting plot reasons, he has to figure out who it is. And it's as well written as any literary novel I've ever read. It's incredible scope. And I always warn people I hated the ending, didn't like the ending, but I still think it's head and shoulders over any other thriller that's ever been written. And I don't know where you could find it. It might be out of print. Probably Powell's might have copies. So, yes?
I guess you do the revenue from a book that you receive. You get an initial contract and then a certain percentage of sales.
Yeah, everyone's always interested in the money. Here's the way it works. So, you get paid in two ways. When I sign a contract, I get an advance. Now, the real term is an advance against royalties. That money is mine if the book doesn't sell a single copy. So your agent tries to get as much money up front as she can in case the book bombs. Then I also get paid royalties, which is a percentage of the cover price of every book that sells. So let's say the book sells for $26 in hardcover, but Costco sells it for $14. I'm getting a percentage of $26. So the way this works is, let's say I get a $100 advance, and the book sells 100 copies, and I'm getting $1 royalty per book. I won't get any money because they advanced me that $100, and so those 100 individual dollars go back. Let's say the book sells 101 copies, I get $1, and I'll keep on getting $1 as long as the book sells. So if you buy 100,000 copies of my next book, I will dedicate the one after to you. Don't be cheap. After you've given money to the Hillsboro Library, just think of someone else beside yourself. You can take out a mortgage. You must have a retirement account.
How does that work when your book goes on Audible or
Same.
virtual?
Say my books are on big print, audio, Kindle, all that stuff. I just get money from each one of them. So some of it I split with the publisher. For a writer, a manuscript is a collection of rights, and your agent tries to give away as few rights for the most money she can get. So every sale to Korea or Italy is a separate sale. And so each one of those is a separate deal. Usually you split book club and audio, big print with the publisher. So they get half and you get half. But your half counts towards your paying off your advance. So, yeah.
So when you hire an agent, what is the typical kind of remuneration that he gets out of your sales?
Yeah, Gene gets 15% of domestic and 20% foreign, because foreign they have to split with usually an agent. Like they have agents in Asia and agents in the Scandinavian countries. But I wrote Gene and I told her I don't care. You got me all these great deals. You can take as much as you want. So
the publisher actually signs the check?
Yeah, I have never gotten a check from a publisher. In your contract, it says that the payment goes directly to my agent. They take their percentage out, and then they send me the rest. So that's how. Yeah.
There's an author, Lisa Gardner. Lisa graduated from Glencoe High School. In your world, do you interact with other?
Yeah, it's not. It's mostly like at writers' conferences. I'm trying to think. I think I've met at least. We may have done an event together at one time, but it's not like lawyers where you all hang out at the courthouse. You know, there are writers that I'm friendly with, like Bob Degoni up in Seattle, and a couple of people that I've known over the years. A lot of times you go to these conferences, and I'll see people that I haven't seen for a couple of years, and we have a drink or something, and it's really fun to see them. But it's really, there aren't that many writers, and you don't bump into them that often. So, yes.
When did you stop practicing law?
1996, because the book tours ate my practice. My first two books, Heartstone, Last Innocent Man, were not bestsellers initially. They were reissued in paperback and were on the New York Times list for weeks. But I didn't do a book tour. There was no advertising or anything. And then with Gone, once you get a huge advance, they want you to try to earn it back for them. So they send you out on these book tours, which I love. I like doing them. But I was doing mostly death penalty murder cases and big federal drug conspiracy cases when Gone hit. And you're in court a couple of weeks, a couple of months, and then your prep time's pretty comparable. You have to spend a couple of months or so preparing. And I was going out of state 2 to 3 months a year on book promotion. And the first time I did it, the judges and DAs were really nice. They said, I asked for a set over because I said, I got to be in Miami. And they said, oh, this is great, yeah, but you can go to that well once. I realized at some point I could not ask the state of Oregon to go on hiatus while I ran around hawking books in Denver. So I had about 2 years worth of cases. I didn't know if I'd be a one-hit wonder. There are a lot of guys that have this one big book and then nothing ever happens again. I'm very responsible. I was married. I had 2 kids that had to be fed and stuff. So I didn't want to just chuck the practice. And also I didn't know if I'd like being a full-time writer. I'd always done it sort of as a hobby. So I had about 2 years worth of cases, and I stopped taking cases. And as the caseload went down, my writing time went up. And after 2 years in 96, I stopped in 94 taking cases. I realized that A, I really liked what I was doing. B, I had 5 New York Times bestsellers, so I knew I was going to do okay. And I love being a lawyer, but I did it 25 years, and it's sort of nice to go from one thing you like to something else you like. So that was why I switched over. Yeah.
So you say you read a couple of books a week. So in the past year or so, what are some of your most memorable reads?
It's hard for me to say because I forget after I read. But the one book I've been telling everybody about well, here's a couple that I really think are astonishing. Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towle, who's going to be talking at Portland Arts and Lectures. That book knocked my socks off. It's what a novel is supposed to be. It's just absolutely magical, and almost everybody who I've mentioned it to who's read it agrees. And then I always recommend this, and you're going to think I'm crazy, I don't read a lot of nonfiction. The 4-volume Robert Caro biography of Lyndon Johnson is mind-bogglingly good. I started it figuring I read about 50 pages in the first volume and that'd be it. And it's 3,000 pages and I zipped through it like it was a political thriller. He's Shakespearean. The guy's an amazing writer. It was an astonishing book. And all my money goes to Robert Caro's HMO because he hasn't finished it. The 4th volume only doesn't even get into Vietnam. And he's getting old, and I don't want him to die before he... Number 5, which is the last one, is supposed to come out either next year or the year after. So I give blood every week. So, yes?
Even here in this short time, you were telling us how your writing process works. You seem to want to share your way to writing successfully. So have you considered instructing in a structured environment such as
Well, I've actually taught creative writing, but you know, the bad part of it is I only know 10 things because I never had any of these courses. So I really, as far as teaching a whole, you know, competent semester worth of stuff, but I do frequently, I have about an hour and a half lecture that I frequently give at writers' conferences called How to Write a Novel in Your Spare Time for Fun and Profit. So I do have, and it's much, I go into more detail than I did tonight. So I like doing it, but again, I don't have enough stuff to do a full, you know, writing deal. So, yes.
So I want to say that.
Wait, you know, I'll get to you next. I'll get you, I'll answer all the questions. Go ahead. Yeah.
So I just want to say how much I admire the fact that you professionally were a lawyer and took that and transformed it into another career. And with that, it's because you're giving back. You might be being paid for it, but you're still giving back. And I'm an avid reader, and I enjoy that so much. And it takes a talent, a big talent, to do that. So I just want to give you kudos for.
Well, you can keep on saying. We have a couple hours. You can. Thank you.
Just missed the second title. Gentlemen in Moscow, what was the other book that you missed?
It's the 4-volume Robert Caro biography of Lyndon Johnson. No. So there's 4 volumes, and each one of them won the Pulitzer Prize, won the National Book Award. They all got all sorts of great awards and stuff, and they're just brilliant. Any? Yeah.
So you said that you read a lot. So is there like a specific genre that you enjoy reading, or is it just?
I read everything. If it's a good, it's either, I hate genres. It's either a good book or it's a bad book. So I read Dickens, Thomas Hardy I'm a big fan of, and then I'll read, you know, contemporary fiction, murder mysteries, science fiction. You know, if it's a good book, I read it. If it's not a good book, I don't read it. So, yeah.
So, if you weren't a lawyer or you weren't a writer, what would you be?
Probably a bum. Well, I was an astonishing actor. I could have had a huge career in film. Yes?
What are some of the challenges of working with copy editors?
Actually, no challenges. I love editors because because of my lack of training. Whenever I have a new editor that I haven't worked with, I always tell them, please don't tell me anything you like about the book, because if you like it, it means it's working. I want to know what you don't like, why you don't like it, and then how to fix it if you've got an idea. And then we have a really non-adversarial conversation to try, because the job is to make the book as good as it can be so you'll have fun with it, and I don't care who helps me. Editors and copy editors are 2 different people. An editor is the guy that takes your manuscript and tries to point out problems and work with you on making the book, you know, better. It might be pacing, it might be the characters not working. Copy editors make sure that if Robin Lockwood has blue eyes in chapter 2, she doesn't have brown eyes in chapter 9. They put commas in and do all the technical stuff. They get the manuscript after you've finished editing. So it's 2 different, and I love them because they make me sound brilliant. You know, my books, my first drafts usually are not, you know, publishable. So you know, you read the final draft, oh, this is a really good book. A lot of it has to do with having really good editors. So, yeah. Yes?
You made a comment about a book might be worth $26 and Costco sells it for $14. And there are companies like that, and Amazon that sell. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about companies like that. Are they good, bad, and different?
Well, you know, I mean, the one thing that's, I mean, I love it when my books they do really well on Kindle and all that other stuff. I don't read them on Kindle because I like books, but the sad part has been the decline of independent bookstores. That really wasn't Amazon. It started with Barnes & Noble and Borders, barging into areas and just wreaking havoc with because most bookstores have pretty narrow profit margins, and you don't have to take half their business away. You take 5% away, it can really put them in the red. So when Borders and Barnes & Nobles came in with those big stores, they usually moved into areas where there were independents, and a lot of times they put them out of business. And then Amazon just made it worse. The good news is, I read in Publishers Weekly recently that the independents are making comeback. But what I'm sad about, 1993 when Gone came out, there were 8 bookstores in downtown Portland. There was Looking Glass, Catbirdsea, Catalyst, J.K. Gill's, Scribner's, and Walden Books in the malls. There was Powell's, there was Borders. There's one now, just Powell's. It's the only independent bookstore, only bookstore in downtown Portland. So that really makes me sort of sad.
Can an author do anything about that?
No, it's all economics, so. I'll take one more question, then you got to put checks into the envelopes. Yeah, go ahead.
As an avid reader, I get frustrated in a very good book when the author hits the doldrums or beats a dead horse. And then sometimes they survive and go on and make the book interesting. What's your theory on why that happens, or have you had that experience reading other authors?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not critical. It's tough to write a good book. I mean, the thing that bothers me is the book that is really good and has a lousy ending, because I think that's being sloppy. Again, with Gone but Not Forgotten, I got that idea initially as a screenplay, but couldn't figure out the ending. And I put it in my drawer for 3 years, and then when I had that conversation at the dinner party, it gave me the thing. So I think, like, when you're writing a book, if I'm going to ask you to buy the book, I got to do a really good job on it. I can't be sloppy. $26 is a lot of money. If I'm going to ask you to go spend that, I have a contractual obligation, ethical obligation to do it. So that's the thing that really bugs me, is when you have a book and it's obvious that the guy just took I don't know what to do. I have a deadline, or I didn't do an outline, or I didn't think about it, or and I just got to finish it, so I'll just put any crap in there. That really upsets me. So, but like I say, it's usually it doesn't happen that often, but it happens enough to make me upset. So, thank you very much.